Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Wright, human cartoonist extraordinaire, and welcome to another Columbus Cartoon Coalition live stream. Today, we are going to be talking about comic book adaptations. With me, I have two amazing guests who are members of the Discord channel. We have Wittershins and Emily. How are you guys doing tonight?
Doing fantastic.
I'm good.
Yay, good to hear. So I guess the very first thing I would want to know is what are y'all's experiences with adaptation, either adapting stories that are originally in comics into other forms or vice versa?
Well, so for me, this is a little fun because I'm kind of a new cartoonist and colorist out there. So I'm kind of approaching tonight as a consumer. I have consumed a lot of adaptations in my life. And so I'm excited to kind of approach it from that angle.
Pretty much same here. I've read like 3 different graphic novel adaptations of books in like the last week to like prepare.
Excellent. Well, I guess most of my experience is also with reading, although I have done some adaptation from Greek mythology into short comics that have gotten published in a couple of anthologies. So that would be the closest thing I have. But adaptation is a subject that I've been interested in for a long time. It's definitely a rich well that you can pull from. And there are always interesting challenges and pitfalls you can run into when you are adapting. So I do want to also throw out there that I am jumping in a little bit last minute as host, just because unfortunately AJ was going to be hosting for us, but she is currently recovering from Con Crud. Pretty nasty case from GalaxyCon. We wish you the best, AJ. Hope you for a speedy recovery. But AJ did send along some questions that I will be blatantly adapting into my own. The first thing I wanted to talk about was how closely should you or should you not follow the original source material?
Emily, would you like to go first?
Sure. I actually wrote this down. What did I write down? Okay. I don't think that has to be like extremely close. Like they don't have to be like an exact recreation of like the original story, but I think it just has to remain faithful and it's like themes and characterizations and just how it like portrays the story. Like I don't think it has to be an exact like scene for scene, especially since like when you have to adapt, like there's a lot of stuff you'll have to like cut out and pare down anyway. And I think it's okay if you maybe like add some stuff too, as long as it like supports the story.
I'm fully with you there. I'm far from a purist in adaptations. I think if you look at the most successful adaptations kind of over time, the most successful have always been willing to kind of make a jump into new territory with the IP. A big property you'll hear me talk about tonight is The Shadow, kind of the origin of the dark, broody superhero. And really, a lot of the comics kind of went in new directions in regards to the character. And every time they did that, they lost a lot of their old fans. They gained a lot of new fans. So I think really how close you stay to the source material really depends upon what your goal is for the project.
And it is interesting because sometimes if you stay too close to a project, it kind of feels like it defeats the purpose of the adaptation. I'm actually looking at a lot of manga and anime adaptations for this. A lot of times I've read a manga, I just haven't been able to get into the anime because I realized all I'm getting is a shot-for-shot recreation. And that can be great sometimes. Like I can definitely think of projects where that has worked out all right. But if I've already read one or seen one and then I jump to the other one, I'm like, why am I doing this again? It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And production side, you run into the issue of, I think, of Bleach first and foremost. They tried to stay 1-to-1 with the production cycle of the manga, and they ended up having to create a few filler arcs to keep pace, and that actually ended up losing some fans and readers in the long run because of that filler arc.
Yeah, actually,
It is
I have a few
funny
books
seeing.
with me.
Oh. What you got?
One of them, Adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express.
Okay, who did that? I need to know. Like, who's the cartoonist?
Bob Al Green.
Cool. I'm looking that up later. I'm a big Agatha Christie fan.
It's really good. It's just that it's a lot of like talking heads. There's just very little action in it. And like, what is the point when it's 80% just people sitting around talking? Like, there's no interesting action to it.
That's funny because I'm also a big proponent of mystery comics. And it kind of saddens me that that's what they do with it, because there's so much interesting stuff you could do with the visuals in comic medium that you wouldn't be able to capture through prose.
Mm-hmm.
It's a feature that I see. Like, I'm a big fan of Weird Western and Western comics, and for a genre that is so heavy on the action, you end up with panel after panel after panel of talking heads a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually one of the things that comics are. It's a lot of people who come from other visual media who come into comics, they tend to run into this problem because there is a lot of talking head stuff in, say, film. Like, you're very often getting the classic like shot, reverse shot type situation. And one of the things you realize as soon as you're in doing comics is, oh, you're not limited by having 3 very expensive cameras. Every single panel can have a different angle if you want, and it can look great. But it is one of the things that definitely gives it an advantage. And I'm actually also glad that you brought up specifically something that was adapted into comics, because I feel like most of the time we're going to be talking the other way around. But I'm very curious with that version of Murder on the Orient Express. Are they not like hiding visual clues in plain sight and stuff like that? I guess that's a story that is pretty talky, but
No, not really.
yeah,
I mean,
see, that's a wasted opportunity.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. It's funny because that's talking about. I guess it's getting away from the original point of fidelity and what can happen when you change media and what you should be looking for. So, in general, when you guys come across adaptations, do you tend to favor? Do you tend to prefer the original over the adaptation, or do you prefer adaptations into specific media over other versions, regardless if it's the original?
So I think I tend to prefer adaptations around IPs. So I tend to find that characters adapt really, really well into new stories in comics, for example, whereas certain stories may not last very well. It's kind of funny that you mentioned we're going to be talking more about comics adapting into other media, whereas a lot of my examples are actually the other way around. I pull from
That's
a
good.
lot of like Cartoon Network comics. Nickelodeon did a lot. A big example I've had on my mind is Futurama. If you compare a lot of the episodes, they would not have worked in the comic, whereas they ran about 80 issues of completely new storylines using those characters. And I feel like if they had tried to preserve those original episodes, it would not have worked nearly as well.
How about you, Emily?
I mean, I don't know. Well, I mean, I have a preference for comics and graphic novels. That's my favorite
Fair
medium.
enough.
But I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer.
Fair enough. It's interesting because I know personally, I try to look at adaptations to some degree as their own thing, like
Mhm.
as if there were not an original. Does this story work on its own, and all these types of things, which is definitely a good way to look at it if you're seeing the adaptation before you see the original or come across the original. Example for that comes to mind. I'm very glad I saw the Scott Pilgrim movie before I read the comic, because I think if I'd read the comic first, I would not have enjoyed the movie.
Mhm.
That's an interesting example of kind of massive deviations in an adaptation. Have you guys seen this movie for just for point of reference?
So I saw the movie, and I'll be honest, I had no idea it was a comic until like 5 years afterwards.
I get that. Like, I feel like it was outside of comic circles, it wasn't an incredibly well-known comic until the movie came out. But yeah, going back to the Talking Heads point, I have definitely seen comics where that kind of works. I know that as part of the C3's book club, we talked a little bit about Frankenstein a while back, the Junji Ito adaptation. Did either of you happen to read that?
I did not get to, unfortunately, no.
Speaking of text heavy stuff, I recommend giving that a look because it is text heavy. It's based on a book written during the Romantic era of England, and so there's a lot. It's very wordy. There's a lot of narration and things like that happening, but it works really well because it's being handled by a cartoonist who knows how to handle visual timing and horror, which Junji Ito is one of the masters of that. Fun fact, I find he's one of my favorite cartoonists of all time. I think he works better with adapting other writers than he does with his own stuff. And I say that deeply loving his own stuff. But yeah, it's interesting that, especially when you're adapting novels to comics, how you tend to run into the problem of, well, are we going to lose the voice of the original author if we don't include mountains and mountains of text?
I think a good example of that is probably the Hobbit adaptation that was done by Charles Dixon, if you've read that.
I haven't, but did they run into that problem or did they get around it?
So they got around it by really pruning the text down a lot to those main conversations, is what I found. They illustrated as much of the world, illustratively as possible, which you can cut out a lot that way. I mean, that's the benefit of doing cartoons or graphic novels is you don't have to describe the scene to the reader. You can just illustrate it for them. And I tend to find that for a lot of media, that will save you some pages.
Yeah, pictures worth 1,000 words. It is also kind of funny that the wall of text problem doesn't really happen with film, like another visual medium that there's a lot of adaptation with. But they just get that you don't need to do that. I have seen art from this. Sorry, I'm looking up that version of The Hobbit. I recognize the golem that popped up. Kind of in relation to this, because we're talking about what works and what doesn't, what are some of the biggest mistakes someone can make when adapting an existing story?
I have an example.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the Maximum Ride novels?
Yeah.
So they're about a group of kids who have been mutated to have like bird abilities, and they have like bird wings, and like their bones are different, and like their circulatory system is more like a bird's, and them being part bird is a very important part of their character and just the story's identity. But there's a Marvel adaptation of it where instead of being part bird, they have like mechanical wings instead. And it completely strips them of their identity and the story's identity.
That does seem like a weird choice. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, admittedly, cool visual. Like maybe that's what they were thinking, but it does feel like a defeating of the purpose.
Yeah, so like just like that sort of mistake of like radically changing like the identity of a story or the characters. It's just like it's just not like doesn't feel faithful, doesn't feel like an adaptation anymore. It's almost like an alternate universe.
I think it's always important to have some early.
It kind of.
Oh, my apologies. I think it's important to have some readers who are fans, and anytime you're going to be adapting something, fly it by them first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is one of the things that is worth thinking about is who you're making the adaptation for, because it's funny when you watch something and you're like, oh, they were trying to bring in an entire new audience, so it kind of defeated the purpose of adapting in the first place. Like you want the fans to be happy, but you also don't want to make something that just the fans are going to enjoy. You have the opportunity to open this up to brand new people. I'm sorry, did my camera freeze?
Yeah.
I did. Oh,
Can you still hear me?
yes.
Okay. Yes,
Okay.
You're moving again.
Sorry, my camera froze for a minute, I think. Yes. But yeah, I don't know if I got cut off, but on the one hand, it's a balancing act. You want to keep the fans happy, but you also want to bring in new people who might not have been exposed. Like whether you like these as adaptations or not, this is one of the examples of the MCU doing pretty well. Like there are a lot of comic fans who are happy with what has been done, and like there are definitely some that are not happy. But the big thing that they did was they brought a lot of new fans in without putting down the comic version, if that makes sense. That's one of the things that tends to get. I don't know how old you guys are. I grew up back in the 90s when there were some real bad comic adaptations coming out. And it was interesting to see when the switch happened. I always credit Sin City with being the turning point of when they finally stopped saying you can't, when you're adapting a comic into a movie, you have to take out all the things that make the comic part fun because movie audiences won't be able to buy it. And they were like, no, we're going to shot for shot this thing, just see what happens. And it worked great. I know we talked before about things being too close to the original, but I don't know, that one hit that balance really well. If you haven't seen the original Sin City, I highly recommend having a copy of the books in front of you and flipping through while watching, because they recreate some of the panels perfectly. And this was back when that was really impressive. I'm also curious, how can you make the story stand out and different from other versions or adaptations? What is it about a comic adaptation that is different from any other medium's adaptations?
So,
sorry, can you hear my dogs barking in the background? They've been
a little
barking
bit, but don't worry about it.
Okay.
You're louder than the dog, so it's fine. We can hear you.
Okay.
Oh, did you have something else to say, Emily?
It's all good. This is what happens when we stream from home. We're all used to it.
And I was just gonna say, like, I can try to do something with them, and you can keep talking. I'll just be right back. Good. You can keep talking.
So, Allison, thanks for joining us.
I think it is important, as we've stated, to maintain that balancing act. A comic, I think of that it was an adaptation of a game. Not sure who's listening in that's played Bloodborne. That game, wonderful. The comic, an amazing recreation of the game experience, because at the end of every single comic, spoiler alert, stop listening now if you want to go read that, it says you died. Because if you've played the games, you're going to die a lot.
That's amazing.
This would not have caught any more readers if they had just picked it up at the store, thumbed through it. Well, what does this mean? But if you've played the games, you see you died at the end page. You know you are reading a Bloodborne comic. It was made for you.
Yeah, I get that, and I also love it. Do you actually see the character die by the end of each
Yes. Oh
run?
yeah.
Okay, good.
And
So it's not just them saying that.
in fact, it becomes kind of a meta narrative within the comic, kind of reflecting upon the player dying over and over again.
Uh, yeah, man, I love that concept. That's genuinely funny.
Fun fact, actually, when we're talking about these adaptations and everything, they actually were very, very careful about maintaining their IP, though, because there is a certain level of violence that is too much for that IP. They actually turned away Daniel Warren Johnson for a cover for it because it was too violent for them.
What's too violent for Bloodborne? Like,
He has it on one of his streams. It is a pretty violent cover.
well, that's impressive because that's a hack and slash game. Like, but yeah, with comics in particular, the things that I tend to notice with comics, of course, there's a lot of film correlation that people tend to do with it. It's a visual storytelling narrative. But the thing that always is pointed out as making comics different from film is timing and pacing. And it's part of why with the adaptation, you do tend to get things wordier because comics have space for words in a way that film really doesn't. Like film has to shorthand because you can't control the clock anymore. The reader can't control the clock. They can't linger unless they go back and play things at slower speeds, which you can do on some platforms. But yeah, most people watching it aren't going to necessarily do that. As a result, in some ways, comics are uniquely suited for things like prose, which are based on having large descriptions, walls of text, and there's definitely an advantage to the fact that sometimes writers need to get to the point, and comics can, and especially if it's taken too long, and you can literally with a comic just go, okay, going forward. It is. What are some other strengths with comics, though? What in particular makes it a good medium for adapting other works into?
So I found it to be a really welcoming medium for adapting horror, primarily because when you adapt horror, you don't want to keep one-to-one to the film tropes because those are specific tropes to auditory cues and things like that. But you kind of open the door to a wonderful little trick, and that is that when a reader has that comic in their hands, they are the ones turning the page. And there is nothing more gripping than being involved in that process. You are the one that has to make the monster proceed down the hallway. You're the one that has to turn the page and see the sword fall, if you will.
Yeah, I will. Related to that, no medium I've come across does jump scares better than comics. Like all the great guys, I shout out Junji Ito again if you haven't read his stuff too, but he's so good at putting the scary panel on a page turn. And like I'm pretty inured to this. I did a lot of horror comics for a while and got pretty used to it. I remember getting a copy of Fragments of Terror and I dropped the book 4 times while reading it. Like that is definitely a good point with adaptation. Although I would bring up one thing that makes it a little tricky. I haven't read it yet, but I did get my hands on a Lovecraft adaptation recently. And I'm a little worried about going through it because half of Lovecraft is not showing the monster.
I
What did you
love
do with that in comics?
I love cosmic horror. I've read a few Lovecraftian pieces, like there was a Shadow versus the Fishmen. I think it was the Shadow over Innsmouth.
Shadow over Innsmouth.
Yep.
Yeah.
But when it comes to real like cosmic horror, I don't know how well it adapts to comics. I'll have to see what your opinion is.
It's definitely tough. It's probably one of the places where, comics struggle comparatively. Now, you always have the option of just doing what they did and not showing it. show people's reaction to it. But in comics, it feels a little weird. Like, it works great in film when they do that kind of trick, but in comics, it's like they kind of expect you. It's like it's one drawing, draw the damn thing.
A little weird to adapt The King in Yellow.
Yeah. Or like, there's the challenge of something like The Color Out of Space. It's like, oh, how do you represent a color that doesn't exist in our spectrum? Now I want to make a comic using UV ink.
Do it.
That would be the coolest thing ever. It would be so expensive. But yeah, I'm curious, because we talked about deviating. Can you think of examples of adaptations where the creator of that adaptation deviated and made the work better? Oh, that's a tough one, isn't it?
That is a tough one because I'm fully within the realm of thinking that like The Shadow's Blood and Judgment was an improvement on the character for the world that it was in. You know, we weren't in the 40s anymore. The world was becoming a little bit more violent, and so this was kind of becoming his own character instead of becoming the precursor to Batman, if you will. I think that was a case where they improved on the character, but I will have a lot of people who say otherwise to that.
Hey, everyone has the right to their own opinion. And it's all media, so we can, enjoy what we enjoy. Emily, do you have any thoughts on this?
There's just none that I can think of at the moment. Though I wanted to go back to what the question you asked earlier about like why comics are a good media for adaptation. I think it's because there's just so much freedom because there are so many different elements. There's like, of course, like images and words. It's like how you want to present the images and words. There's like boundless ways you can do it. And there's also ways that you can like, frame it, like, like frame panels that you might not be able to do in like a movie. Like you can control like the pacing, like we said earlier, the flow. I feel like it's just like a boundless medium.
Comics are also uniquely suited for guiding the eye in particular. That goes into panel shape and doing stuff like that. You can use elements in the panel much more easily to point to stuff, which can always be helpful in like guiding specifically how the reader experiences things. Got a comment from Dylan in the chat. I know coming from comic books to another medium that's a more recent property. The Boys is a great example of that, but I am curious on any that came from another medium into comics. We have been covering a couple of those. I know growing up, one of the things, honestly, it just clicked with me. There's one comic adaptation growing up I was obsessed with. There was this, I needed to look up who the author was. There was a comic adaptation of the opera The Magic Flute that I was obsessed with as a kid. And I'll tell you, I've watched The Magic Flute now as an adult. It's way harder to get into opera for me. I'm so happy comics exist because it made it work way better for my brain. Also, in my opinion, yes, better ending because they actually had an action scene at the end. It's what kills me. Like I can't get into opera because too much of what exciting happens off screen or off stage. But yeah, it's I've definitely seen adaptations that have into comics that have been incredible. I brought up Frankenstein earlier. That's one I highly recommend anyone check out, especially if you're a horror fan or a British romantic literature fan. If you're up for a depressing read, there's also No Longer Human, which was adapted by Junji Ito. It is one of the bleakest comics I'd read in a long time, and it's so good. But it's fascinating watching this stuff get adapted because so much of it is based on, like, part of the power of prose in particular is everything is based on your imagination. The words are basically putting a version of it into your head. And what's great about being a creator is you actually can share the version in your head with other people. And especially for a lot of people who turn to art as a profession, the version they think of is crazy or goes in ways that people might not have thought of. And you get to share that with other people.
I remember there were some graphic novels of Edgar Allan Poe's work that were done in the mid to late 80s and early 90s that were, I can't remember who did it at this moment, but they were just amazing. Like, the art in them still lives in my head rent free to this day. And
there's a more recent set of adaptations. I'm trying to remember the cartoonist who did it. But I remember the main one I read from that was they had Mask of the Red Death, and the way
yes,
they drew that, I will always remember. I want to say it was Ben Templesmith.
That sounds familiar. Everybody rush off to the keyboards.
Yeah.
Like, I find that poetry really, in kind of that area between poetry and prose, can really make amazing comics because, as Emily said, there's this freedom. And when you have the freedom to interpret visually exactly what these set pieces look like, but you still have so much verbiage to work with, you have so much just that the author has left you, that as an artist, you still have a lot of freedom to construct the set for the reader.
I'll throw out one that also just occurred to me because it's a great use of comics for, like, comics are a great way to adapt it. I have several Shakespeare adaptations into comics. And it's fantastic because I think one of them is called No Fear Shakespeare, adaptation of Hamlet. And so much of the visuals are kind of literal versions of whatever metaphor is being described. It is used very talky. It is very verby. It's Shakespeare. But like, one of the challenges with Shakespeare, I say this as an English and drama double major from back in the day, is that everyone's taught to read it and it's not meant to be read. So comics are a great opportunity if you don't have a chance to go see a play somewhere and you don't want to watch Kenneth Branagh's stuff. One of the things I also kind of want to go back to is we talked about how you can do kind of anything in comics. There's a lot of freedom there. I'm increasingly in favor of comic collaboration, but one of the things that really got me interested in the first place in comics was, if you need to, one person can do everything. There is a great deal of freedom if you have a specific thing you want to say, a specific way you want to say it, you can. And that lends itself great to adaptation. Because at worst, it's taking one thing off your plate. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about designing stuff from an adaptation. What do you think are the best ways to take, let's say, non-visual work? Let's focus on that kind of thing. Let's say you've got a novel you've got to adapt and you're trying to make a comic and you're trying to figure out what the characters should look like. What steps do you think need to be taken to make that work and keep it faithful when you don't have a direct visual reference? That one's a thinker, huh?
That, I didn't know I was going to get a hard question like that. It looks like Emily's got an answer, though.
So again, comics are a visual medium, and with that, character design is super important, but you can tell a lot of the character through their design. Like, when in a book, it's like, you know, their actions and their words and stuff, but you can look at a visual character and be like, bam, okay, they're wearing this set of clothing, so they might be into like this style, or they're like this in this class, or they have this job, or maybe they're like big and blocky, so that means they're like stable or powerful, or they're like thin and like or circular, or you can go into like visual language and base the design off of that, if that makes sense.
I
It
actually
absolutely does. It actually also brings up an interesting point that this is kind of a hard question to answer when you have multiple people with different art styles, because a big part of what you bring into the adaptation is how you draw and how you can, like, what your style design is. Like, from what you said, Emily, I take it that you're very shape focused when you're designing characters. Like, I know people who are like, okay, triangles all over the body. That's how we're doing this one guy. It's like the jaw is a triangle. It makes a little triangle chest, stuff like that. All the clothing has little triangle shapes in it.
But I think Emily is really onto something with that. The visual shorthand of like archetypes, we've kind of developed that as a way of going, okay, reader, here is this character. If you roll back to the early 50s and look at a lot of the adaptations of literature pieces like Robin Hood or pieces like that, there are some characters that they don't describe what their faces look like in the original tales. Will Scarlet is not overly described in his facial features, but we get descriptions of his swordplay, of his clothing. And so from there we can go, okay, well, if he's this agile with a sword, he's probably going to be kind of lithe, and can go from there. So I am definitely in agreement.
You actually also bring up kind of an interesting point with that, because I think a lot of the adaptations that we get culturally are based on other people's adaptations. Like, it's hard to draw Robin Hood without thinking of Errol Flynn, despite the fact that that's not necessarily what was in the original books.
I've been even like, I've got a little personal project where I'm wanting to illustrate out, I don't know if you've read it, Titus Groans, but the original author actually did some illustrative work for the piece, and the characters themselves don't even look like how they're described perfectly in the book. And he'll leave like a page and a half description of one character, still doesn't match it. So even if somebody is drawing their own work, it's important, I think, to remember that everyone is visualizing these characters a little differently.
I'll throw another wrench in there. There's a degree to which, if you're going for specific imagery on, especially for characters that don't have that imagery already, how much is that imagery necessarily defining them? Like, does it need to be there for the character to still be valid? Like, let's take Robin Hood was a good example. What would happen if you made Robin Hood built like Little John? So he's like huge and bulky and muscular, and he just completely ripped, which is why he can use a longbow so well, because those things are tough. But like, would that necessarily change everything, or would the character still be there if he's robbing from the rich and giving to the poor?
I feel like we're actually getting, although it's not literature to comic, I feel like we're getting a comic to comic answer to that right now with the Absolute DC series. Where they're
Are they going to be doing a
redesigning.
Green Arrow thing? Because I actually would love that.
So I don't know how familiar you are with the current DC Absolute series, but they're going back.
You're talking about Batman, aren't you?
They're going back and they're redesigning the character and going, okay, but how much does this actually matter in the design, and how much is this new thing accurate to what the character stands for?
That also gets into another type of adaptation we haven't gotten to, although we've alluded to it a few times. Intramedia adaptation. When you're taking, comics do this all the time, where you're taking one property that's already been established in comics and you're adapting it into a new version for comics. Absolute Batman's a great example of this. Any Elseworld stuff with these characters is an example of it. and it's interesting to see where people tend to get mad about it. What do you think about when big swings like that are taken, though? Like, for anyone who doesn't know, the Absolute series for DC, the concept behind it is they're basically doing an Elseworlds, and they're asking, what if blank was different in a character's life? And for Batman, it was, what if Batman was poor? What if he did not come from money? What if the Waynes weren't, wealthy billionaires or any of that? What if he's just kind of like an average Joe who's just got, like, how do you still make him Batman? And that type of adaptation is always kind of interesting, where you're taking a big change, a big swing, and seeing what that does with the character. Where does that go well, and where does that go wrong?
I think one of the easiest places for it to go wrong, and this is kind of an odd one, is when a project does not have a studio or the writers or everything standing behind it long enough. So they'll adapt a project into a new form, and then you get a few stories, but you never fully get to see it fleshed out. Marvel was really bad about this in the early aughts, with the early Ultimates. They kept a few of them around, but it really seemed like they just let the series putter out instead of coming to any sort of conclusion for the titles. That's something I've definitely seen.
Yeah. DC and Marvel have been guilty of this many times over. My first introduction to superhero comics was the New 52. And I know that's not a great place to jump in. I know, I see your face.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
I will defend some of it. Not most, but some of it. But it is interesting that you see these series start and they're taking swings and they're trying to do stuff. And then the creative team will swap and it'll just go completely downhill. Or you'll run into actually, here's another thing that tends to happen more with comics than anything else. You have the form of adaptations, which is crossovers, which can be an absolute nightmare.
I was actually reading Spider-Geddon the other night, like to relax from studying up for this. And one of the things that came up in it is how well they visually nailed adapting the PS4 Spider-Man back into a comic character, keeping that fluidity and motion of a game character versus a comic character.
I find that hilarious because I felt like the game did a really good job adapting the comic fluidity. Because like I've tried drawing Spider-Man a couple times. That's hard. Like the comic guys who do that, really good.
The trick is to not pay attention to how the joints work.
Yeah, no, that's the weird thing. I can draw a lot of things in motion. I have a hard time drawing Spider-Man. But yeah, it's interesting because we're currently in a period where a lot of those types of adaptations are happening. There's a new Ultimate Universe where they're taking swings. Like, what if Peter Parker was a full adult, married with kids before he became Spider-Man? What if I don't know what the deal is with Hulk, but it seems like what if Hulk found religion or therapy? One of the two.
They had to do something after turning him into a literal space shuttle. My favorite character.
Weird stuff happens with Hulk.
Sorry, what?
Basically, Banner ends up piloting around Hulk as a living space shuttle. It's disastrous. He ends up murdering a few people accidentally, but I digress.
Okay. Sure.
Spider-Man is excellent. Yeah, it's, but yeah, like it's all part of the adaptation stuff of what if you change a couple little things. How do these characters deal with it, and how do you still keep them as those characters? It's always a fascinating take on any of that type of mythology, which is really what superhero comics are. They're modern myths. And the big problem is there is a very clear written record of what is canon and what is not, which is the one thing that makes it more annoying than myths. Like, if you do weird stuff with Zeus, nobody's going to care. I have an adaptation of Zeus where he's bald and has no beard. No one cares. As all I got to keep in there is that he's kind of a jerk and a misogynist.
Well, the thing with
he's
like
not the good guy, don't worry.
The thing with like mythology is that there are so many different versions of like stories. Like again, like you said, like there's no like one canon thing. It's like all, you know, it changes a lot throughout time. And I think, how do I want to phrase this? Like this like Absolute series, I think it sounds really cool. It's kind of like no, I'm not going with that train of thought because it doesn't make any sense.
Most of my trains of thought tonight haven't made sense, so I feel it.
I can't make the puzzle pieces match up in my brain.
Yeah.
What I originally wanted to say was that it sounds cool. It just has to make sense. You know, a lot of the time, like when, you know, stories like take big swings, it's like, does it make sense? Like, are you just doing this for like shock value or kind of like, whoa, wouldn't it be super duper crazy if this were to happen? Like, okay. But are you just like throwing random stuff at the wall? Like, how does this fit with the character?
I mean, to be fair, the reason the Absolute Universe happens is so convoluted, but it's comics. It's okay. Like,
but
I think basically Darkseid is building a new universe and is trying to get rid of the heroes and failing, which is basically the exact plot for the Ultimate Universe, but it's Mentor. So it's basically evil Reed Richards who made his brain big and long.
But I do have to agree with Emily that there is a level of intent behind the project that matters. Why is it being adapted? You know, is this happening because it's a advertising project for a larger studio like we see out of Disney? They did that recently with Lilo and Stitch. Fantastic comic, but obviously leading things up into the new movie. Is it trying to reinvent a property like the Absolute series where they're trying to capture new readership of the younger readers, Gen Z and Gen A? Or is it simply to refresh the IP so that you can sit on it longer? You know, I really think the intent really matters.
Yeah. One thing I do want to quickly throw out, we are at about the 50-minute mark. If anyone in chat has questions for us, now would be the time to let us know. As you can see from me bringing it up on screen, we do see when you guys comment. One of the things related to that with intent, it's one of the things that I've heard said about parody, and I think is very true for adaptation. Because what is a parody but an adaptation? And that is that you only want to adapt stuff from a place of love. You don't want to adapt something because you hate it. And that happens sometimes, and usually it's malicious and nasty. The example that comes to mind is the Roland Emmerich Godzilla movie. I see pain in your face. But one of the things Roland Emmerich said is, I don't like Godzilla movies. I don't get why people like them. So he tried to make a version that he would like. And the problem is people who are going to want to see Godzilla like Godzilla movies.
You know, the newer Star Trek movies that came out like, gosh, I don't even know. It was like years ago. My memory is slipping, but the people, like the director of those movies said he'd never watched Star Trek.
Wait, J.J. Abrams hadn't watched Star Trek? He's such a nerd. How is that possible?
Yes, that guy.
Yeah.
Or wait, let me.
It's funny because I think those adaptations are fine. I know it drives people crazy, but I do think I had fun at least with the first one.
Yeah, they're fun, but it's like, how can you make a faithful adaptation of something if you don't know the source material?
I
Yeah.
kind of wonder if he read the novels by chance, because those are pretty exhaustive too.
I'm going to bring up, because we're getting in some questions in the chat. Danny asks, what's the strangest, most random place inspiration has struck you? I get a lot of horror comic ideas while watching horror movies, and they are not in any way related to whatever horror movie I'm watching at the moment. It's completely different. I wrote a comic called The Light Outside the Window, and I know the exact moment I came up with it. I was watching the original Suspiria, and there's a shot where she's looking in a mirror. Nothing of that is anything related to the comic I wrote. But for some reason, that's where I got the idea for the entire story.
So I have to say the media that always inspires me the most is when I am putting my hands on a video game that I can tell the devs visually loved what they were working on. I started playing a game called Hunt Showdown back in 2021, and I sat down, started doodling, started making some thumbnails. That's what's now got me on my current Weird West project.
Emily, any thoughts on this?
A lot of inspiration for my stories just comes from me talking to myself.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
And I'm also like on the internet and social media a lot. So I find inspiration like from probably the 300 different art blogs I follow. Just from people like all over the world making so many different types of art. And it's like, whoa, this looks cool. This looks cool. This looks cool. This looks cool. It's like you should see my like inspiration folder of saved pictures. It's like most random different stuff, but it's like, it's also yummy.
Have you ever been inspired by the color palette out of like a screenshot from a movie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've definitely I'm a big fan of the Persona games, and those color palettes will make me do all kinds of crazy stuff. Just to throw it out there, this is not one of the questions in the chat. We'll definitely get to them. I'm seeing there are a bunch of awesome ones. But how have either of you ever adapted a song into comic?
Yes.
Or into an illustration?
That's so fun. That's the most fun thing.
I've done that as album art because I've actually done singles for an indie artist, but and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's a really fun one to do. You're just listening to the song, you get the colors, you get the visuals.
I've known so many artists that they can't listen to music with lyrics, or else they end up just pouring that into whatever project they're working on.
I thankfully don't have that, but yeah, I know people who have that same problem. Allison asks, what do you think is more important in adaptations in media, the intent or the impact, and why? I am always forgiving of work if I can see good intent. Like, I actually get made fun of for this because even if it's not an adaptation, if I will defend things if I'm like, okay, I can see what they were going for. They didn't quite pull it off, but I appreciate the idea. I appreciate the attempt. I'm also a little torn because, to be fair, if you screw up the impact, nothing else really matters.
I think I'm on the side of intent, because I think as long as your intent is good enough, I think we're at the point with media and preservation of media that project, if the intent is good enough, will likely outlive you and may be rediscovered someday. And through that, it may have a larger impact than it would have had during your lifespan.
Emily, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree in that, like, well, I just think the impact is based on the intent. Like, you gotta have the intent first. And then like the impact will follow, hopefully.
I do have an example of an opposite here where they had really poor intent, but the impact was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys have ever heard the origin story of He-Man as a comic, so the toy predates the comic, even though they were launched on the same exact day. And that's because the comic was created during a pitch meeting via a lie. So they had originally said, hey, here's this action figure. They're like, well, we don't know that this is an IP nobody knows. Nobody's going to buy it. They're buying Star Wars. And he's like, well, didn't you hear? We're publishing a comic with it. There'll be one in every box. And so here's a comic book created kind of not with the greatest of intent, but boy, the impact was huge.
Yeah. That actually kind of reminds me of how Nausicaa, the first official Studio Ghibli project, got launched. Like, he wanted to make this movie, and they're like, "But there's no comic for it." And he was like, "Give me a week," for however long it took him, and he drew the damn thing. I gotta bring up this question because it makes me happy. In the cartoon adaptation of your life, what genre would it be? I'm gonna go ahead and say you can't say memoir.
It would be a Sunday strip funny.
I like that. I'm kind of leaning horror, but like psychological horror, not like anything else. I want slow creeping what's going to happen going on in mind.
You just want to get people to pick up the next issue.
Yeah, exactly. But it's probably going to be one that people abandon after like it. You know what? It's a horror manga that's been going on way too long. And people are just like, this has gotten boring. They jumped the shark like back in his early 30s.
They pick it back up once it's an anime.
Comic school was great. What's happening now? Emily, you got an answer?
I think mine would be like a dramedy, part drama, part comedy. And also, like the Lizzie McGuire series where she imagines herself as a cartoon doing random stuff, that would also be included.
Nice. Yeah, I think mine would look like, I'd want it to be very much like Junji Ito's Cat Diaries. I know I mentioned Junji Ito a lot. I like Junji Ito. Sue me.
Junji's amazing.
But his cat, if you haven't seen his Cat Diaries, they are, you know what I'm talking about. It is the funniest damn thing you've ever read, because especially if you know all the other stuff he does.
And also, that's a really good exercise. Like, as we're talking about adaptations, as an artist, whether you're a writer or anything like that, try taking a piece of media in one genre and try adapting it into something else. And you will find odd amounts of success. I feel like that cat story by Junji is a perfect example of a wonderfully positive story told through the eye of horror, and it works.
I don't have a good answer for this question, but in case you guys do, Danny asks, what's the weirdest thing you've Googled for the purpose of comic research? I do murder mystery stuff, so I have to Google a lot about like poisons and crime and stuff like that. So my search history is messed up that way. I did recently have to look up household poisons for something I'm working on. I'm sure I'm on a watch list now.
That was going to be my thought, is how many watch lists are you on now from this? I think the craziest thing...
DuckDuckGo, it's fine.
I think the craziest thing for me has just been the most mundane of objects. Like, what does a wagon wheel look like in 1866?
Yeah. Or like you're looking for any image of Okay, you know what? I actually had a recent one that probably also put me on a couple lists. But I was designing a high school character, and I needed to look up what current high school fashion looked like. So I was like, what search things can I put on here that doesn't make me sound like a creep? I just need to know what the Zoomers are wearing.
Just add like stock image after the search.
That's actually a good call. I should do that.
Yeah, for me, it'd probably just be like different poses, like the things I've had to type to try to find the right pose
Yeah,
to reference off of,
we've all done that one.
and like different like body parts.
All right, moving on a little. Danny also asks, what's the one thing you hope people take away from your work? I personally have just one goal: to entertain. That's my job. Whether it's humor, horror, mystery, whatever I do, I want you to have had fun with it.
I think I'm similar. I want to leave them wanting to read more comics, even if it's not just mine. Like, even if you hate my stuff, go read somebody else's. That's what I want to leave somebody with.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I'll throw out another one then for cartoonists who read my stuff, or other creators who read my stuff. I want them to do better than me. Like, I hope either you read it and you get inspired and you make something of your own that's awesome, or you read it and you hate it and you make something that is better than that just to spite me. Do it either way. Just keep making stuff.
I think for me, it's like just a sense of connection, like connection to like the characters or the stories or the themes, just to be like, yeah, I feel that.
You want people to feel seen in your work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We got another question from Allison. What's better, a happy ending or a bittersweet one?
I mean, personally, I always like happy endings. I mean, I feel like with a bittersweet ending, it can leave you like wanting more or thinking more. Like I feel like that's like with tragedies, it's like you just kind of like replay it in your head like over and over, like what could have happened differently. And bittersweet, it's like, okay, what could have happened to give them like a happier ending?
I think in regards to adaptations, I think happy endings work best, because in comics, we know happy endings are never forever.
In serial comics, anyway. Yeah. My answer is kind of non-committal. It depends on the story. Like, if you're doing horror, I always like stories to have some form of closure at the end. Things might not be fully over, but I want things to be kind of wrapped for the moment, at least. But that could be good, that could be bad. There's also burnout if you go too dark too often. This isn't comics, but Paranormal Activity has this problem. I actually have a friend who's a huge fan of found footage. We've watched all the Paranormal Activity movies together. The biggest problem I have with it is too few wins. Like, you need, in most of these movies, everybody dies. Or, like, spoilers, sorry. Or something bad happens to, like, everybody. And it's like, that's great for even most of it if you want. You got to have a few people get away, just so you have reason to keep hoping. Kelsey is weighing in. Hello, Kelsey. After reading Michael Moorcock's Elric novel, The Citadel of Forgotten Myths, my favorite ending is a cathartic one. That's a good way to put what I was trying to say. Yes, cathartic. I always like a little return to stasis. And I've definitely read stories where it's like, oh, this ending is so bleak. I'm not sure if I'm going to read anything else by this person. And then I did because they got better at writing. But like that's always kind of tricky. I also want to bring this up. This is about the conversation we had before about wanting people to do better. I feel like in a lot of creative fields, there's an unfortunate scarcity mindset with making art or entertainment. Art and entertainment this is one of the great things with comics itself, outside of the actual physical printing of the comics. If you want to do web, the only resource that you have a scarcity of is time and energy. That's it. It's one of the things that makes comics great. If you can take the time to put it down on a page or online or however you want to do it, then you've got comics. And at that point, and there's such it doesn't even feel like there's that much competition, at least at the indie level. I'm sure the big guys like are fighting each other all the time, and with great big drawn sound effects. But yeah, I feel like especially in the indie circles, we support each other because we're all making stuff that's completely different than what the other people would make. All right, we are a little bit past the hour mark. This got fun.
It did.
Emily, where on the internet can people find you? If you're on the internet.
I am on the internet. I'm on Tumblr and Instagram at I don't even really know how the word is pronounced, and I've used it for many years. It's antipelargy, ANTIPELARGY. And it's
Did I get it right?
.art. Yes, like that.
Cool.
And then on Instagram it's like .art, and Tumblr it's like a -art.
.art or -art. Awesome. Mm-hmm. And Wittershins, where can people find you?
You can find me on Linktree/Wittershins. And I'm mostly active on Blue Sky and YouTube.
Apologies, I didn't have a chance to make this beforehand, so you might have heard my typing.
It's all good.
Yep. And you can find my work at bwhcomics.com. I'm also at bwhcomics on Patreon, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. You can also find my weeb comic Cospain, a weeb comic about cosplay and convention craziness, over at cospaincommic.com. So we're going to wrap that up for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us and for all the active stuff in the comments. And yeah, until next time, rock on, guys, and never stop drawing.